Okay, well, I think I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to all of you for coming today. I know this is probably the craziest and most stressful time of the semester, so I'm especially appreciative of you taking time out to be here and think with me about this issue of housing affordability. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank James I'm horrible with your name, Pistajevsky, Josh Childs, Haria Japar, and the members of the Ed Talk Committee for inviting me to do this talk today. I'm very honored to be invited to be here. First of all, I'll just tell you, for those of you who don't know me, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I see many familiar faces, but a few that I haven't met before. My background, I have a bachelor's in sociology, a master's in administration planning and social policy, and a PhD from UCLA. When I joined the program, it was an education policy program. Later, they changed their program name, good morning, Dr. Science, to urban schooling. So that's why I always put in parentheses urban schooling. Dr. Science was there at the time that UCLA changed that program name. Oh, you were? Oh, okay. That's all right. I'm introducing myself. I've been a faculty member here since 2007 in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy. So broadly, what I study is the intersection between school reform, equity, and diversity. That's kind of the general area of work that I do. And I'm really interested in how patterns of racial and ethnic stratification in schools and housing shape opportunities, experiences, and outcomes for children. So I'll tell you, though, a little bit more specifically my trajectory as it relates to this particular topic around housing and housing affordability. My very early work, my dissertation, I studied how parents use housing to gain access to desired schools. So my study was looking at how parents used home purchases to get access to schools in desired attendance zones and how they made meaning of school quality. So I've always been really interested in this issue around housing and educational access. But since that time, I have focused on education policies that have sought to address patterns of racial, ethnic, social, and class segregation between schools, such as school desegregation policy and interdistrict school integration policies. That's been a study of, I just recently have a book that's come out on the interdistrict policies. And I also have really been interested as an ed policy person on how schools cope with the issues they face as a result of these patterns. So how do they respond to pressures from testing and school choice? I've really studied how schools with high concentrations of poverty respond to these pressures. And also, most recently, I'm working with Dr. Jabbar. We're going to be launching a project on issues of teacher turnover, which of course are particularly problematic issues in high poverty schools. So those are so I've always been interested in issues of segregation, and also how schools that are segregated and have high concentrations of poverty cope with the pressures that often disproportionately face them, right? So testing and accountability and school choice, those are the schools that are often under most extreme pressure from these policies. But now, I'm returning again to some thinking around the housing market and how housing shapes educational access and experiences. And as I was mentioning to James earlier, this talk has been a really great excuse to kind of get back into this work. When I first said I was going to give this talk, I just recently got awarded a grant on a teacher turnover project, and so that grant has taken, to get the groundwork laid to start the data collection this coming year, has taken a lot of my time. And then some of you may know I've been involved with AERA this year, so that's taken a lot of my time. So I'm just really excited to have a chance. This talk has given me a really great opportunity to kind of start digging back into this issue that I had conceptualized this project, applied for IRB approval, got AISD approval, so I've had all this project kind of ready to go, but then it got a little bit, I got a little bit busy this year, so this talk today it's really been fun to kind of get my thinking back oriented here, and I'm hoping to spend some time this summer focusing more on this. As I mentioned, professionally I've been interested in this intersection between housing and educational access, but I'll tell you a little bit about my personal background and kind of why I think, where I come from, where I come. So this picture is of me and my brother around 1976, 75. I was 4 or 5 years old. My brother is a lot older than me and 10,000 times cooler than me, and he still is to this day. He is from my dad's first marriage, so classic 70s hairstyle. He's in rock and roll, and he's a Hollywood guy, and he's like amazing. So I live with my dad and mom. He didn't live with us because he's from my dad's first marriage. But we lived in San Diego, but unfortunately, their marriage didn't work out. So this is before the divorce. My parents divorced when I was 6. My dad got the house. He stayed put. I lived with him 2 nights per week, but I lived with my mom 5 nights a week. My mom had been out of the job market for many, many years, so she went back to school and got a job as a computer programmer, which she actually hated, which was unfortunate. But my mom struggled with affordability. So we lived in what was then a high opportunity neighborhood in a high opportunity school district. It was a district with, part of the district was Rancho Santa Fe, which many of you may know. It's a super wealthy part of San Diego. So we had some really high wealth communities in my high school attendance zone and my school's attendance zone. We were not wealthy, but my mom was really trying to move around. When we were moving, she was really trying to ensure that we could stay in the attendance boundary of my school district, and that housing was expensive. So we ended up having to kind of move a lot, either because rents went up or because we had some weird landlords that were, just putting a lot of pressure on us for various reasons, or who would come in unannounced, or strange things like that. So we moved quite frequently. So I kind of had this dad who was stable, but mom, we're always moving. Luckily, I didn't have to change schools, so that was good. But because of her efforts to keep me in the same school district, we had to move a lot, and we had to pay a lot for housing. So 2 things that kind of, I think, as I reflect, this research is me search, I think that came out of this for me, is, because I attended what was then a really pretty wealthy and affluent high school, I was really, excuse my typo here, I have a fascination with the ways in which schools reproduce the privilege and the benefits that they bestow on, especially some students. Now, my campus had, there's a community, a long-standing Mexican-American community that was in our high school's attendance boundary that was very isolated within my high school and didn't get any of the same opportunities. But for the students whose fit the model that teachers were looking for, there were a lot of benefits that flowed through that school that I could witness. And I was also fascinated with how parents navigated the housing market, like my mom. How do they try to ensure opportunities for their kids? So that's sort of where I come from in this whole journey, and why I've just always been fascinated with this issue of housing and educational access. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about 2 things, if I can get to them. First is the main focus, which is this, as I mentioned, this sort of new research area that I'm exploring around how parents are navigating housing affordability. And I'm going to present some national data that sort of frames this issue. One of the things that I've also motivating me for this is that I teach every year, I teach for our master's program a class called Poverty and Education Policy. And what I have students do is they do a really in-depth analysis of census data around a particular, usually high poverty school. And so they track trends over time, and year after year, I've been teaching this class now for 10 plus years. And you see, they track median rents, they track income, they track the percentage of their income that goes to rent. And every year I teach this class, the incomes oftentimes are decreasing, the poverty rates are rising in certain census tracts, and rents are certainly going way, way up. So in Austin, you all live here, it's expensive to live here, but especially I'm really worried about families with kids and kind of how they manage that. And I think a lot of the stories around gentrification is really interesting and important, but there's a bunch of neighborhoods that aren't gentrifying, and so families are still struggling very much there. And so I just think, I'm just trying to start thinking about how do parents deal with this? How do they cope? And when I was looking at the research literature, there's virtually nothing out there on how parents navigate and manage this. It's just really, I feel like, a gap. Matt Desmond's Evicted book, I think, has been a really good national conversation starter about this. His book looks really at families who are, at the absolute most risky point of the housing market, and he really he shined an important light on those families, but there's a whole subset of families that kind of fall above eviction risk, but are still struggling deeply. And so I think there's a real need to think through and understand how parents navigate that. And if I have time for this, I'll also just talk a bit about some research I've been doing around federal affordable housing policy and educational access. So as we know, there's federally funded affordable housing projects and/or housing tax credits and/or housing choice vouchers. There's a number of ways in which the federal government subsidizes and tries to help families. And one of the projects I've been working with a couple of our one recent grad and a few of our current doc students is where those subsidized housing, what kinds of schools they're zoned to. So like really how that shapes access. All right, so that is kind of where I'm headed today. All right, but let's talk first about part one and see how far we get. So my first focus is how parents navigate housing affordability. And what I'm going to talk about today are what are some of the trends in price of housing and affordability more generally. What do we know about how these trends affect families with children and families by race and ethnic status? And then what do we need to learn? I think there's a lot about that. One of the ways I really bring, lenses I bring to my work, I really am very structural in orientation. So anyone who's taken a class with me, I really think a lot about structural inequality and inequality in the housing market. And so this is sort of a lens that I like to I ascribe to. I really like this idea of critical bifocality, so that when we're essentially studying the experiences of individuals, we need to keep in mind the broader structures and contexts that are impinging upon them and affecting them. So it's not understanding how people are managing or navigating or making meaning or what's happening on an individual micro level. It's really important to zoom out and situate those folks within a larger context. So critical bifocality is a theory of method in which researchers try to make visible the sinewy linkages or circuits through which structural conditions are enacted in policy and reform institutions, as well as the ways in which such conditions come to be woven into community relationships and metabolized by individuals. So the commitment to bifocals, dedicated theoretical and empirical attention to structures and lives, can be adjusted to various contexts, historic moments, and accompanying institutional arrangements. So I think Matt Desmond's work is a really good example of how you can be a bifocal, right? Because he really taught in his work. I don't know who here has read Evicted yet. Okay, awesome. If you haven't, pick it up. Summer reading. It's a really a brilliant study, but I think he really tries to situate the experiences of the families that he's interviewed and followed and documented within the broader context of shifts in the housing market, shifts in the economy and the labor market. So that's sort of the approach that I generally try to bring to my work. So that said, let's think through kind of that upper layer, the zooming out lens. And obviously studying of housing affordability and how different families cope really must begin with the structural context. Many of you have probably heard of Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, and many other studies have illustrated how, and any studies of housing and families must acknowledge the intervention of the state, meaning the federal government, and giving whites advantages in the housing market. There's many researchers that have written about this. Most recently, Richard Rothstein, I think, has brought this back onto the national stage in a way that I think is really important and helpful. And it's something that I think is a baseline that you have to begin to work with in understanding. And what he writes about and what these scholars write about is the direct intervention by the US government in the 1920s to the 1950s, especially in the housing market, denying home ownership and wealth and asset building for families of color. There's a wonderful new video summarizing this book that Richard Rothstein himself narrates. Has anyone had a chance to see this video yet? It's really phenomenal. All right, I'm going to give you a 90-second preview because I have the stage and I get to. This is sort of feel like if you get nothing out of this talk, maybe this is it. But let's see if this will work. Hopefully. Whoops. Wait, hold on. Let me switch out here. I'm gonna have to escape. And then I'm not sure if my sound is gonna work, but we will see. I'm a little worried about this, but no sound. Anyone know how the sound works on here? I have them hooked up here. Let's see if there is a sound thing. Sorry? There was some sound. Oh, there was sound. Oh, it was very, well, I think it was coming from my laptop. Yeah. It's okay if we can't. Yeah, normally there's a little audio cable. All right, well, no big deal. I think if we can't find it very readily, then, that might be it. All right, if this works, we'll go with it, and if this doesn't, I'll keep going. I think you got it. All right, let's try this again. I can tell it's going to work. Well, darn. All right, well, darn. Okay, well, anyway, I'm going to encourage you to see this video, but it's a really incredible kind of summary of the work that that is in the Rothstein book and of others, and I think it really documents this, this intervention by the federal government and sort of the extreme lasting inequities that result from this intervention in the housing market. One of these lasting inequities is that there's a dramatic racial disparity in home ownership rates that is lasting, and it's partially or substantially resulting from this. So non-Hispanic whites have much higher home ownership rates than African Americans or Latinos, who were both systematically denied access to home ownership opportunities, while whites were systematically granted benefits and home ownership opportunities that they were then able to pass down to their children and grandchildren and accrue wealth. So, so there's dramatic and lasting differences in home ownership rates as a result of these policies, and most significantly, lasting disparities in wealth between racial and ethnic groups. As a result of the fact that whites were given federal advantages in buying houses in the housing market during that time period, white families have substantially greater net worth in terms of assets than African American or Latino families, and that is probably one of the most glaring, lasting outcomes of these policies. And a lot of times we say, well, income inequality between racial and ethnic groups may be somewhat moderating, but wealth disparities certainly are persistent. And this is what Oliver and Shapiro calls it, the sedimentation of racial inequality, this idea of these policies then lasting over generations. And another important point that I think is too often overlooked is there's modern day, race still plays a role in the housing market today. There's still differential prices paid for the same housing and or differential loan terms for the same housing. So it's really, there's still an ongoing premium in the housing market for being Black or brown in the US. Banks often dissuade people of color from home ownership, either through different lending terms or just dissuading them from getting loans altogether. There's some research that finds that Blacks pay a premium on rent in predominantly white neighborhoods. So there's ongoing, this has been practiced in the past, but these issues are not gone. Okay, so now on the top of a really highly unequal, so we're sort of starting at the top, these highly unequal and stratified market. So now, fast forward, to current context here. Now we have really deep troubles with housing affordability. The housing prices are highest they've been in 10 years. Affordability is lowest. The median home prices have increased 76% since bottoming out in the first quarter of 2012, while wages are largely not increasing at the same rate. So this is really resulting in both an increasing proportion of renters, so more people are renting than ever before because they just can't get into the housing market. And so rental rates are back now up to where they were in the 1960s. But also rents are rising. So they're increasing, and the top line is the cost of rent. The bottom line is median household income, and you can see incomes are largely stagnating, although I know this trend line in recent years has been a little up, which is good. But largely rents are outpacing income growth. But what's important to know is that the rental market is still disproportionately more people of color. So due in part to past policies, established owners are more likely to be white. New owners are also more likely to be white because they tend to inherit from their parents. And then those of the rental market are disproportionately Black, Latinx, young, single parents, low income. We actually don't have, at least I haven't been able to find a lot of data on intersections between these kinds of things. So low income African Americans, right, or low income single parents, et cetera, although those are usually very, very often overlapping. But the rental market typically is more Black and brown. And you can see, although overall rates of rentals, people who are renters are going up in each of these groups. So, so because housing affordability is a problem, more people are renting, but still overwhelmingly, these rental problems are, really, the rental market's really affecting African American and Latino families. But more significantly, there is an increase, so not only are rents rising, but there's actually a radical increase in the percentage of families that are considered cost burden. So if you pay more than 30% of your income in rent, you are considered cost burden. And that, you're not, anything more than that, you're paying too much for rent. So this graph shows the share of families with cost burdens, so it's a dramatic rise. And then this is the median income, again, the stagnation that we talked about earlier. And then this is median gross rent. So rents are rising, the share of people that are actually paying more than 30% of their income in rent is going up. while incomes are not going up as much. In fact, according to the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard in 2018, they said the cost burden share of renters doubled from 23.8% in the 1960s to 47.5% in 2016 as housing costs and housing income steadily diverged, the largest increases occurring in the 2000s. So somewhat moderated in somewhat recent years, but it's still pretty terrible. One of the contributing factors that I found as I was putting together this talk that I thought was really interesting is that it's not only that there are more renters competing for the same kinds of housing, but that the types of housing that's being built is not matching the needs of renters. So this graph shows the change in the proportion of renter households. So the orange is within these income bands. How the proportion of renter households have changed. And the purple shows the change in the proportion of units affordable to those households. So I think this is really incredibly interesting because it really shows that obviously the proportion of renter households at the lower end of the income spectrum have increased quite a bit, but that the number of units being built that can match that income level have actually decreased. And then there's a large number of household increases at the higher end, but there's also not enough housing to meet their needs, but that's okay, because I can just afford these. But really what ends up happening is you're pushing these two groups up into the middle, and so as a result, there's just not a lot of housing at the low end, and you're having to pay more for housing. Austin, so the colors and everything are a little, I think, backwards on this one, but this shows in Austin what's happening. So this is the increase in the number of low-income households in the city of Austin, but this is the change in number of units available at that income level. And so you can see in Austin, there's barely any units built at this low end. There's quite a few units available at the middle ends, but this really means that these families are having to go into this housing market and paying more. But keep in mind, this is only the city of Austin. There's all these suburbs around that I think are worthy of investigating. We don't know a lot about what's happening in, for example, Manor, Round Rock, Pflugerville, Del Valle, where a lot of low-income families are moving. And so I think that we just need better data around those issues. So as I've been looking into this, and I've been looking in Social Explorer and all the census data, I've been really realizing I'm not able to say a lot about what's happening, not as much as I wish. So I'm hoping that, going forward, we can get better data. As a result of these trends that I was talking about earlier in terms of which kinds of housing are being built, we now have actually a really increasing proportion of renter households at the lowest end that are called severely rent burdened. They're actually spending 50% or more of their income on rent. So remember, housing cost burden is 30% or more of your income on rent. Severe cost burden is if you're actually spending half or more of your income on rent, and the proportion of those families increased by 42% between 2001 and 2015 to 17%. And you can see that so this is the lowest quintile in income, and the folks that are rent burden and then severely rent burden. And then the second quintile in income, they're kind of approaching rent burden levels. So this is not something that just affects lower income families, but other families, possibly could be feeling the squeeze as well. But again, as I said earlier, the rental market is largely more black and brown. And this shows that the cost burdens are disproportionately borne by Black and Hispanic families. So this is, again, the severe burden, and this is moderate burden. And so this is 50% or more of your income in rent, and 30%. So this really shows, this is how the burdens are distributed by race and ethnicity. And then again, trying to get at some of these sort of intersections around low income and by race, or low income by family structure. So this is the only chart I could find, only data I could find that was reported out by this. But I think it's really, really interesting. So I'll point you to a couple things. One is that low-income families, so of low-income families with kids under 18, they're paying roughly 60% of their income for rent. After rent, income is $443, and about 73% of these families rent. So this is really interesting. So looking at these intersections shows really that low-income families are struggling pretty significantly. By race and ethnicity, I thought this was incredibly fascinating. So roughly the rent-to-income ratio, white, Black, and Hispanic families are roughly paying, they're all severely rent burdened here, 55%, 54%, 57% of their income for rent. I think this is fascinating. Low-income Asian families are paying this data says 3/4 of their income for rent, more than that. I thought that was really remarkably interesting. And then if you can look at income after rent, low-income Asian families only have $250. where these are roughly equal. Where these aren't equal, though, is that you can see that largely low-income Black and Hispanics are much more likely to be renters than whites. So while white, Black, and Hispanic low-income renters look somewhat similar, they're also not, in that more shares of Black and Hispanic low-income families are actually renters. And then low-income Asian families, there's something going on there that's really pretty significantly problematic. So they're sort of the worst off in this whole group. But also, as the previous slide indicated, rent-burdened families are financially insecure in many other ways. Not surprising. It's not surprising at all. But 2/3 had less than $400 cash in the bank, and most of those households that had less than $400 cash in the bank are African American headed, and that largely, again, goes back to this big structural history that we have in this country around housing and access. Half had less than $10 in savings across varied liquid accounts, while half of homeowners had more than $7,000. And this is a 2018 report out of Pew Trust. They do have some data. They look at the wealth data. And importantly, we start to think about, okay, so what does this mean for the types of choices that families and children are, families are making for their kids? They often spend and are able to spend less on food, less on transportation, and less on health. So it's sort of thinking through what are the implications here. And this is some of the first, some of the only data I've seen in terms of, okay, so if families are facing burdens, what kinds of trade-offs are they making? But I argue, and this is setting up my study, which I will do, is we really need to interview families about how they're kind of trying to come and make sense of this. And what strategies that they're using to cope with these new conditions. So looking at the research, what happens to parents with children in the housing market, especially low-income families? So obviously, one of the things around families is that they often have difficulty in finding affordable housing. The Department of Housing and Urban Development just recently did a pilot paired test. So this is often used, and especially for many years in terms of racial discrimination, they'll send a white renter and a Black renter out with the same credit history, same income, same job, and just see what kinds of housing they're shown and what kinds of rents they're offered and all of that, and what kind of quality housing they're given. And the paired tests for many, many years have shown discrimination, although one hopes it's getting better. And I think it is, the data do show that it is, but it still somewhat persists. But families are actually often discriminated against. So it's not terribly severe according to the study, but families were often showered fewer units, so they're given less options, and then options that had higher rents, especially with 2 children versus 1 child, especially. Inadequate housing is a problem. So the Joint Center for Housing Studies, this is just a general problem for low-income families. There's lots of unsafe housing out there, and there's sort of oftentimes limited laws. State laws vary, but limited laws to protect them. Overcrowded housing is a big one. 16% of the sample at Harvard's study were living in overcrowded households, and there are many, many children living in such households. The rates of overcrowding, the data on Los Angeles and New York are really mind-boggling. It's like somewhere, I don't have the stats right in front of me, but it's somewhere around 40 to 50% because the rents are so high there. And as Matt Desmond's work shows, vulnerability to eviction and instability. Matt Desmond and Gershenson did a study recently that they found that the likelihood of eviction increased with the number of children, net of socioeconomic factors, race, and rental payment history. So family status alone increases one's likelihood of eviction. And research shows that each of these things are, especially inadequate overcrowded housing and eviction, are lead to lower outcomes for children. Liz Muller here at the Department of Urban Planning and her colleague wrote a good review of this. And there's also the impact of what I sort of call the geography of opportunity. So thinking around access to affordable. So oftentimes if your housing choices are limited, you're oftentimes restricted to neighborhoods that may not have traditional grocery stores or traditional banking institutions or access to transit. So where the kinds of restrictions that you face may actually shape the kinds of opportunities that you can provide for your kid in other ways. And especially thinking through access to schools and school quality. That's a really big thing, and that's going to be sort of my next few slides here as well. So what do we still need to know? After kind of preparing this talk and having read the literature on this for a while now, we need a lot better data, data on families, and especially by race, ethnic, linguistic status, immigrant status, and parental and educational status. So single parent versus grandparent versus, what kind of households look like. And, and by these intersectional identities. We just, to my knowledge, I'm still getting a handle on the data sets that are out there, but there's just, if the data's there, there's a need for more of these kinds of analyses. So that's sort of something I'm going to be looking into. And then this is sort of the study that I've been wanting to do and have had approval for, and I hope to do this summer of it, is how do parents cope with this? What resources do they draw upon to help them manage these challenges? Do they, what kinds of family, community, educational resources are there to help them? What barriers do they encounter in this process? How does the negotiation process vary by family background and geographic context? And how does this negotiation process shape opportunities that parents are able to provide for their children? So around neighborhood quality, school quality, healthcare, time investments, sorry about the typos, food, clothes, et cetera. So that's kind of where I'm headed next, so stay tuned for that. And then I have another set of slides that I wanted to show you about my other area of work, which is something that I've been doing now for over a year. Anyone recognize this? I know, I'm going to look over. Rosewood Courts. And anyone know the significance of Rosewood Courts? Yes.
It was built during 1937
Yeah.
It was one of the housing projects in Austin. It was one of 30 that were built, and it was segregated for blacks only in East Austin. The other two still existed as well, but they were built in other parts of town.
Exactly.
For Latino families and then one for white families also.
Absolutely, thank you. Even better than I could have said. Thank you. So yeah, and it's one of the first housing projects, one of the first federally financed housing projects to be built in the country. Austin is home, our claim to fame. But as anyone who knows the history of public housing and federally financed housing, is it followed some of the same similar patterns that the federal intervention in the larger housing market followed. So they often were built in segregated neighborhoods, to Tabitha's point, and they followed patterns of segregation. But there's a little. Since that time, we continue to build we continue to have federally financed affordable housing, but it looks a little different today. So today, there's less actual public housing being built, and more of the federal dollars are going into low-income housing tax credits. So they're actually trying to subsidize private developers to build affordable housing. And then there's also another very famous kind of type of affordable housing. Anyone know the other type? Housing vouchers, exactly, right? So housing, which used to be called Section 8, now they're called housing choice vouchers. As we know, in Austin, the wait list had been closed from 2014 to September 2018. It just reopened for a week, closed back up again. So the demand is clearly outpacing the supply on that. So there's not, in fact, only 1 in 4 eligible households actually receive any kind of assistance from any of the federal dollars that go to affordable housing. So we have different types of assistance. It's not enough. But I was really interested in, and I started with some of our doc students, Joanna Sanchez, who graduated a couple years ago, Michelle Kennedy, and Sarah De La Garza. We've been looking at how affordable housing relates to educational access. So our goal is to understand for families living in federal financed affordable housing, what types of schools they got access to by indicators of quality. We're still in the middle of this, so it's still sort of early days, but I'll just share with you some of the early stuff that we're finding. We looked at 2 types of housing, because housing choice vouchers require a different data set because they're individual families, and so we don't have that data. But we do have the location of public housing. And there's 2 types of public housing. There's lower income families and then very low income families that are eligible to live in like Rosewood Courts type housing. And then there's the low-income housing tax credits, which I just mentioned to you, which is privately built housing subsidized through tax credits given to corporations or investment groups. And they're usually available for families earning 60% or less of the median family income of the region in which they're being built. So we basically used GIS to locate all of these properties in 3 metro areas. We're actually now expanding to 2 more. And we mapped where those were, and then we use attendance zone boundaries to identify the elementary school attendance boundaries in which they're located, and then which schools they're zoned to, the properties are zoned to. And then we looked at TEA data. And so we're just beginning to look at this data. So this is just like our first cut into the data. And then we actually have a data request coming back from TEA. We're waiting a few months. They said next week. We'll see. But we're looking at issues around segregation by race and poverty, proportion of beginning teachers, average teacher experience, and teachers with advanced degrees, which in some literature suggests these matter to kids. So this just shows in San Antonio, where the properties are located vis-a-vis the child poverty rate of census tracts. And so a couple things are of note. There's the housing developments are in blue, and then the low-income housing tax credit properties are in black. And San Antonio ISD disproportionately has the most public housing developments. So these are the school district boundaries here. But and then there's some dispersed in some of the outer suburbs, and then there's relatively more low-income housing tax credit properties distributed more broadly. But largely, these properties tend to be located in relatively high poverty census tracts. In Austin, the patterns are a little more stark, I'd say. So we have public housing developments typically, of course, all on the east side. Almost all of these properties are in Austin ISD. And they're mostly, the relationship between where they're located and the poverty rate seems to be a little more clear here in Austin. So although in recent years we've had some of these low-income housing tax credit properties be built further out. And then Houston, it's sort of, it's a lot and all over the place. But the low-income housing tax credit properties are kind of everywhere. But again, you can see if you look at kind of like where the lowest property, if you look at the white census tracts, which are the lowest poverty census tracts, you don't see a lot of property, you don't see a lot of dots in those tracts. But you do see it tracking a little bit between poverty rates and where these properties are located. But again, I also like to think about like which districts are housing these, and I mean for obvious reasons and historic reasons, but Houston certainly has by far almost all the public housing projects and a lot of the low-income housing tax credit properties. So that's sort of what we've been mapping and looking at, and we're also looking at middle and high school data, but this is, we looked at elementary schools, and what we did find, a couple things. So these are, we looked at segregation by race and income, teacher quality indicators. Like I said, early days, forgive us, these are just averages. So these are not, sophisticated analyses. We're gonna get more into this, so this is just kind of our first cut at the data. But what we did is we looked at average percent of economically disadvantaged students. This is sort of overall in each county, and then the schools where, schools located in elementary attendance zones with low-income housing tax credits, and those properties that are not zoned. So for example, in Bexar County, the average percent economically disadvantaged students in the whole county is 70.7%. Students living in low-income housing tax credit policies are zoned to schools that are on average nearly 90% poverty. Students living in elementary school attendance zones that have no low-income housing tax credit property are zoned to lower poverty schools. So, it just kind of begins to illustrate some of that. So you can see that the students living in those properties tend to be zoned to higher poverty schools. They themselves are high poverty, but the extent to which they are contributing to that is a little unclear. And this is public housing. Interestingly enough, in Travis County, the disparities aren't as big, or not at all. In fact, students living in public housing tend to be going to lower poverty schools overall, which is kind of interesting. And this looks at African American and Latino families. We just, for this analysis, just did those two things. And so generally, students zoned into those, living in those properties are zoned to schools that have higher proportions of students of color. Although public housing in Travis County doesn't quite follow that pattern. And then we looked at the average percent of beginning teachers, and we found that students living in low-income housing tax credit properties and public housing tend to be zoned to schools with slightly higher percentages of beginning teachers. For both of these, and then lower level, first year beginning teachers here again, and then lower levels of a teacher experience slightly, although we need to be more sophisticated in our analyses than just averages here, so we'll get into that. Again, this is also average years of teachers experience for public housing, again, lower levels of teacher experience, and roughly equivalent numbers of teachers with master's degrees, largely for these two properties, although there's even slightly better situation here in Harris County. So essentially, Our summary is this. In Austin and San Antonio and Houston, students living in low-income housing tax credit and public housing tend to be zoned to schools that tend to be more isolated by race and income, have more beginning teachers, and have overall lower levels of teacher experience. And that schools seem to have roughly equivalent master's degrees. But again, I'm just going to put a huge asterisk by this because this is not, again, simple averages. We're not doing a lot of sophisticated analysis here. In the future, we're going to expand our analysis, add more types of housing, we hope. We're expanding to middle and high schools, and I have a data request to get in more indicators of educational opportunity, including access to AP courses, teacher turnover rates, teacher absences, et cetera. One of the interesting things that I really want to dig into is Texas, not surprisingly, was subjected to a lawsuit around how they kind of operate their affordable housing, and it's particularly around their low-income housing tax credit. The way they distribute that money. And so as a result of that lawsuit, basically they were accused of just only financing properties in high poverty neighborhoods. So they were found guilty. And so for about, I think it was around 3 to 5 years, the state changed the criteria by which it allocated those dollars. And when they did that, they actually incorporated measures of school quality as one of the indicators. And so what ended up happening, at least according to a very preliminary analysis by the Texas Low-Income Housing Coalition, they found that as a result of, because the points, the way they distributed those points and those awards, they actually ended up having some low-income housing tax credit developments moving to higher opportunity neighborhoods. We want to dig a little bit more into that. But I think there's some really good examples of that here in Austin. There's a new, Foundation Communities has a new one out on Cardinal Points up in the Northwest. They had one in the Southwest. And so those really are, I think, an example of what happened when the state changed the way it allocated those, the system by which it allocated these dollars. But being Texas, we no longer do that. So somehow that system was canceled. It's still a little unclear to me how or why. But so it may be going back to the old way of doing things. But I really want to kind of do these maps by new and old housing and seeing what happens. Okay, so that's sort of the two projects I have going. Tying it together, I think we don't know enough about how parents cope with affordability, as I was mentioning in the first part of my talk, or how these coping strategies affects them and their children. We also don't know enough about how the little affordable housing that does exist shapes access to education for children and families. And the implications of the larger question is how, the bigger question and the most important question is how can we better support families through education, through housing policy, for equal educational opportunity. So that's sort of the thing that I'm concerned about in this strand of my work. So that is it. I got through both projects. My contact information, if you have any, this is Twitter, my Twitter handle, email, office. You can see me, call me, email me. But I'd like to just answer any questions that you have right now about any of this work, or hopefully your thinking can help me in development of my thinking on these issues. So I welcome questions. Yeah, hi.
I'm doing research on housing for families leaving domestic violence situations that are in transitional housing.
Wow.
And so I'm doing a lot of program evaluations both in Houston and Austin.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
I didn't know if you have any thoughts on that population, because it's the same population, but there's this intensive amount of services, but
Right.
they're still facing that same job market, in terms of success.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. And, one of the things that I'm curious about is the extent to which you're able to find housing for these families, especially because a lot of the affordable housing that exists, they have a lot of really long wait lists in terms of, getting into these kinds of housing, or even knowing about where to find it. How do they even know how to navigate it? I think a lot of the low-income housing tax credit properties, it's not immediately apparent, if you're a low-income family, how you even find out which those are. And then the other thing I think you mentioned around services, which is something that I know a couple of our amazing students are doing research on gentrification, Mike Scott and Greg Pulte, just to name a few. But an effect of gentrification is that oftentimes housing is becoming least affordable near all the social services, right? So in the city core, you have a lot of nonprofits that have been established for years because they served a traditionally low-income population. And now, as affordable housing's further away, how do you get access to those services? And so those are just some thoughts I have, but I think that's a really awesome question. I'd love to get your contact information after and keep in touch about that. Yeah, that'd be great. Oh yeah, hi.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. It was very want to like preface my question
Yeah,
with that. Like,
that's
I have
fine.
a background in this. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear more about how like private builders
Mm-hmm.
are engaged or can be engaged in helping to reduce these disparities.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest, so as I was kind of mentioning before, with the low income housing tax credit policy, that is now where the vast majority of our federal dollars are going, is to incentivize private developers to start building more affordable housing. So that is, kind of our de facto national affordable housing policy, I think right now, you could arguably say. So there's a huge role to be played by private developers. It's interesting, though, in terms of who they build housing for. I think there's a lot of questions around that, and where they build that housing. So that's the big question, are they being incentivized to do good things around putting housing in near schools that have resources? Are they being incentivized to build housing for families? There's been some, many of you are probably aware, there's been some investigations around, oftentimes developers might want to build housing for elderly people because housing for families is seen as less desirable. And so that's a big problem. And also developers face a lot of barriers if they even want to do the right thing. Previously, Texas law had really given a lot of weight to if a community, even just like one member of a community wrote a letter of protest, it would be seen as, it would be given a great deal of weight in terms of deciding, if they're going to fund two projects and this project has a letter, even if it's from one community member, it could really reduce the chances of that project getting funded. So protest, and oftentimes a lot of people don't want low-income families in their backyard. So developers have a big role to play, whether they can be incentivized to do the right thing and are given help in doing the right thing. I think that depends on state policy. I have a couple of colleagues, Kara Finnegan at Rochester, Liz DeBray, and then Phil at University of Georgia, and then Phil Tegler at the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. They're taking a look nationally at low-income housing tax credit policies and how that relates to this issue of educational access. But it's a really good and complex question. They have a big role to play, but again, I think how we can get them to do the right thing is important. There's also somewhat discouragingly, there was a recent investigative report that was done a few years ago, and some of you were in my class when we saw that video on the low-income housing tax credit. It was a NPR reporter that went off and did a big investigative report, and unfortunately, there's some accusations of dollars that aren't as well spent or efficiently spent in that program, so there's some concern there as well. So it's complex and not great, but I guess the hopeful side of this is that when Texas did change its system in terms of how they decided what projects got funding, for a few years it seemed to do better. So that gives me hope that these things can matter. Yeah, James.
Have you thought all about?
Yeah.
It's not related to that question, but
Yeah.
the role of zoning and
Mm-hmm.
local level
Yeah.
policy decisions?
Yeah, that's a huge problem. Was obviously, for those of you, many of you probably know, but zoning is local land use regulations that cities adopt about where sort of, multifamily housing can be built, or, they set oftentimes minimum lot sizes for certain houses, or, setbacks, so that some neighborhoods, I always liked in my class, I use Westlake as kind of a good example of that, right? So they often, there's not a lot of apartments in Westlake, and I don't know this, but I suspect that it's because they have very few areas of Westlake zoned for multifamily housing, right? That allows that. So I think your question's a really good one in terms of not just Westlake, right? Many communities in Austin. Westlake's sort of an not egregious example, but one of the ones that many people are familiar with. So zoning is an incredibly big problem. And in Texas, we have so there's this other thing called inclusionary zoning, which is some states have adopted, or cities have tried to adopt policies to say, for every certain number of houses you built, you have to set aside housing for low-income families or multifamily units. Montgomery County, Maryland's a really famous place that's done inclusionary zoning, and they have some really interesting research about educational outcomes. Guess what? In Texas, we have a law against inclusionary zoning. We are not allowed at the state level. There's it's a very anti-affordable housing state, I think, in many ways. And so zoning does play a big role in terms of where people can build. And then even cities that want to do the right thing are prevented from doing so. But I looked at examples of, I think if anyone's interested in this issue around inclusionary zoning, looking to Maryland. I don't know, some of you may know this as well as I. I know the state of New Jersey had a big lawsuit, and now they build affordable housing in more locations. So there's examples out there of ways in which zoning is used the right way. But yeah, for sure, zoning really contributes to this problem. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
First of all, I mean, on some of the tax credit properties, there are actually a lot of good nonprofits. Austin's lucky
Right.
we have some good nonprofits,
Right.
like foundation communities who are building tax credit properties and do want to do the right thing. And get
Yeah.
them. And I know for foundation communities in particular, they always wanted to have properties in higher opportunity areas, but the state policies were making it more difficult for them to
Mm-hmm.
be able to win get enough points because they prioritized
Yeah.
that they prioritized lower income neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And actually, Austin just passed on the zoning issue. Austin just passed an ordinance
Mm-hmm.
that resolution is being turned into ordinance that would make it easier for nonprofit or other kinds of affordable housing developers to build affordable housing in a greater range of neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see how that
Yeah.
plays out. But it allows them to have more units on a lot than would otherwise be allowed, and
Mm-hmm.
lower setbacks, and applies to all neighborhoods in Austin. So it'll be interesting to see, what kind of difference that might make.
Yeah.
But then my question I was going to ask
Yeah.
is about the Asians. I'm wondering
Mhm.
if that's because those families are prioritizing education so highly that they're paying more rent to be in higher opportunity.
I think that there's a question out there about what's happening. If these are, I think because that subset of, I can actually go back to that slide. That subset of family are very low income, so they're typically probably families that have, they're the bottom, I guess the lowest quartile or quintile of, oops, I found it and I lost it. Oh yeah, the lowest income quintiles. There's a lot of diversity within the Asian population, right? And so I'm thinking that's probably more a function of their low-income immigrant, possibly immigrant families that have are really economically struggling. So I think that's more a problem with the Asian category, is right. All these categories are a problem because they, clump people together. But I imagine that's illustrative of that issue probably more than anything. Is what I'm guessing. But again, needs more research. So I hope folks dig into that. Yeah. But yeah, the fact that the income after rent, this is pretty alarming. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. This is really fascinating and, of course, also horrifying.
Yeah.
So what that indicates.
Yeah.
So I have two questions. One is about, I guess, nuances in the category of rent. I don't know if the data is just like you're living in a property you don't own. That's like all it says. But I think there's a lot of, based on my experiences trying to find my own housing in Boston, there's a lot of variance in terms of whether you're renting from someone you know, whether you have like a house, whether you're in an apartment complex renting from
Right.
a bigger
Right.
apartment.
Right.
I'm also sort of curious about this. I would think about it as a public transportation problem, or I guess it's just a transportation problem if you live far out, right? Because an example, I know a lot of my friends who are able to afford housing in a more affordable area, like say live in Pflugerville, almost requires them to have two cars.
Right.
As a result, if it's even just like just a cohabitating couple.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious if that's also what you're seeing in your research about like how transportation really, even if you can't afford your housing, how much of your income then in transportation increases?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think it's, to be honest with you, having dug into this issue, I don't think there's as much information as we need to know out there, especially around parents and how they deal with this. And so that's really what I'm really interested in getting into, is how these parents are making these trade-offs around these kinds of decisions that they're making. I know, for example, from Greg Pulte's dissertation, we have, people driving really far, right, to get back, they've been displaced, and then they're driving incredibly far to get groceries or to get back to their kids' school. I don't know if you want to, share that.
Most been displaced for was out in Manor and Del Valley and eastern Travis County. In my research, I found that oftentimes there's no work there, so they were driving back. Something 25, 30 miles for some of them daily. A lot of them my parents would work in construction, and so they would leave very early in the morning and drive to the work sites and then come home late in the afternoon. Kind of odd hours to avoid traffic, which is a real problem for people
Yeah.
coming and going into Austin.
Yeah.
But the other issue was food deserts out there. Really, if you wanted food locally, there weren't really any restaurants. There weren't places to get anything other than like convenience stores, dollar stores. And some of them would kind of have a meat market and a little vegetable stand, but that was the extent of it. So oftentimes people would be driving 25 miles and hour and a half round trip just to go to H-E-B. The H-E-B that they shopped at when they were living in East Austin before they were displaced by gentrification.
Yeah.
It's quite astounding the measures that people are taking to get to and from work and just to have food access.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here locally.
Absolutely. And I think your question around transit and, the cost of cars, gas, maintenance, and car insurance, I think that's, a really interesting question we just don't know enough about. But yeah, good question. Yeah. Yeah, Tabitha.
I was actually thinking about transportation too, and like knowing, being a first-time Austineer, I guess now I've been here a few months, and I know how horrible traffic can be, and how I also take measures to avoid that. And I was thinking about, is there a way to, or is there any research, or is there a way to sort of come up with a quality of life measure that measures all of these things and sort of comes up
Right.
with some sort of measurement of how people are coping with these changes, with high
Right.
rents and things like that, like
Yeah.
a very like big picture of their
Yeah.
entire lives. Like, can you
That's a good
access
question.
good education for your children? Are you
Right.
in a food desert? Are you
Right.
going to commute 50 minutes,
Yeah.
from here to there, or go
Yeah.
to the grocery store? Is
Yeah.
there anything like that in research?
Not that I've seen, and I think that's a really interesting question to think about, like a typical day in the life, right? And kind of what all the micro decisions and the calculations that need to be made, right, around avoiding traffic or all of these things. So I think I have not seen it. I'll look for it now that you've mentioned it, but I don't know that it's out there, and I think there needs to be a lot more research on it, especially as it affects different kinds of families, right? Yeah. Other questions? Comments? Well, I'm so grateful for you all for coming out on this Friday morning and participating, and you've given me some great questions and things to think about. If you're interested, please email me at the email. Oh gosh, it's gonna take me forever to get back to that slide. But if you can email me or call me or tweet at me or whatever, I'd love to hear from you. So please do so. Thank you very much.